Over spring break, I read Our Psychiatric Future by Nicolas. I chose this book because last year I enjoyed Neuro, the New Brain Sciences and Management of the Mind. Both of these books are written from a critical neuroscience perspective. The critical neuroscience perspective isn't anti-science, but it does ask why contemporary neuroscience has gained so much traction in our culture. Neurobiological conceptions of personhood are influencing everything from child rearing to criminal justice, and are transforming the ways we know ourselves as human beings. The critical neuroscience perspective asks whether the perceived normative significance of neuroscience is always justified. To give you a sense of where this movement is coming from, consider this quote from Nobel Prize winner Roger Sperry. Ideologies, philosophies, religious doctrines, world models, value systems, and the like will stand or fall depending on the kinds of answers that brain research eventually reveals. It all comes together in the brain. This doesn't sound like science to me. It sounds like biopolitics or some sort of neuroideology. Nicolas is professor of sociology in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. Our Psychiatric Future is a 250-page book with 9 chapters. What is psychiatry? Is there really an epidemic of mental disorder? Is it all the fault of neoliberal capitalism? If mental disorders exist, how shall we know them? Are mental disorders brain disorders? Does psychopharmacology have a future? Who needs global mental health? Experts by experience? Is another psychiatry possible? It was the interior of the book that I found the most interesting. Chapter 2 begins by remarking that claims about the large number of adults and children suffering from mental disorder are very familiar. For example, consider this quote from the World Health Report of 2001. Today, some 450 million people suffer from a mental or behavioral disorder, yet only a small minority of them receive even the most basic treatment. Already, mental disorders represent 4 of the 10 leading causes of disability worldwide. This growing burden amounts to a huge cost in terms of human misery, disability, and economic loss. Nicolas Rose's answer to this question of whether there really is an epidemic of mental health disorders is a decided no. He wants us to remember that these figures about global mental health are experts' estimates of undiagnosed mental disorder. There are undoubtedly very many people experiencing forms of mental distress, but most of these arise from experiences of adversity, and many of these forms of adversity can and should be tackled directly without the need for individualized diagnosis requiring treatment by medically trained specialists. Chapter 3, Is It All the Fault of Neoliberal Capitalism?, is getting at the question of whether elevated mental distress could be a function of how society is currently organized. On the one hand, neoliberalism is simply an economic term. As defined in Wikipedia, neoliberalism is characterized by free market trade, deregulation of financial markets, privatization, individualization, and the shift away from state welfare provision. Neoliberalism is currently the dominant ideology of many governments in developing countries, and of the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the World Health Organization. This ideology postulates that the reduction of state interventions in economic and social activities and the deregulation of labor and financial markets have liberated the enormous potential of capitalism to create an unprecedented era of social well-being in the world's population. However, detractors of neoliberalism would say that its policies have been responsible for a substantial growth of social inequalities, and that the major beneficiaries of these policies are the dominant classes of both the developed and developing countries. Some have argued that neoliberalism is creating loneliness and other factors that are wrenching society apart, and that the epidemic of mental illness is crushing the minds and bodies of millions. Others have pointed out that mindfulness-based stress reduction has become a capitalist spirituality. I myself am a meditator, and mindfulness-based practices have been extremely useful to me. But it is interesting to note that mindfulness-based stress reduction is an effort of an individual to improve their own capacity for resilience to stress, as opposed to an individual or group effort to alleviate the causes of that stress. Nicolas suggests that we should be cautious about sweeping generalizations about the reasons for the rise in mental distress, but individualization, marketization, and excessive competition for economic success could be playing a role. As for the more general point concerning the social determinants of mental ill health, both in the recent life of individuals and in their past, well, these are well-founded in evidence and can't be denied. We are beginning to understand the mechanism through which such adversity acts, notably via stress pathways and other pathways leading to epigenetic changes that affect neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. Chapter 4 asks the question, if mental disorders exist, how shall we know them? And Chapter 5 asks, are mental disorders brain disorders? Nicolas argues that current diagnostic approaches within psychiatry are misguided. This is not merely because of diagnostic expansionism, which is transforming many of the ordinary vicissitudes of life, such as sadness, shyness, childhood irritability, and so forth, into psychiatric categories, but also because of the belief that the ultimate truth of such disorders is to be found in the brain, and hence it must be toward the brain that such diagnoses should be targeted. Nicolas argues that we should replace diagnosis with formulation. Diagnosis allocates individuals to particular categories on the basis of either their symptoms or their biomarkers or brain signatures. Formulation is an account that seeks to make sense of a person's current difficulties in terms of aspects of their current situation. For example, their relationships, their experiences at work or in unemployment, their housing and financial situation, and indeed their own ways of making sense of their situation and accounting for their mental distress. Chapter 6, Does Pharmacology Have a Future?, was one of the most interesting to me. Rose notes that while the rates of prescription of psychiatric drugs seem to be rising worldwide, evidence shows increasing doubts about the efficacy of these drugs, and the founding hypotheses as to their modes of action are certainly now discredited, and the large pharmaceutical companies are currently withdrawing from psychiatric drug development as they've had little success in bringing new and more effective drugs to market. I was surprised by the many key players in pharmaceutical development that seemed to recognize that the psychopharmacological experiment was very costly in terms of research funds and researchers' time, and most crucially, it did not alleviate human misery. Thomas Insel, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, who insisted for so long on the potential benefits to patients of the vastly expansive program of neurobiological research that he funded, said, "I don't think that we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness, and I hold myself accountable for that." But Nicolas asks, who will be accountable for the many millions of individuals throughout the world taking medicines of dubious value for conditions of dubious diagnostic validity, while key figures who determine funding and shape research in psychiatric neuroscience still cling to the dream of molecular explanations and molecular interventions? This question is one I wish to pursue in further reading. This is in part because it's related to my research on metabotropic glutamate receptors. But it's also because I know many people who have been helped by psychotropic medications. And at least for now, I find it hard to accept Nicolas Rose's insistence that the faith of many doctors and patients in the efficacy of psychiatric drugs is misplaced. To conclude, I highly recommend Nicolas Rose's Our Psychiatric Future. If you ever read it, please let me know what you think.